Okay, let's keep reading the 13th Reality Journal of Curious Letters. We're getting close to the end. We're up to chapter 47, Annika's Toss. The dark sky had the slightest hint of purple as the Realitants shot out of the forest and skimmed along the canopy of trees. Following Mothball in the lead, Tick knew he should be terrified, but he already felt completely confident in the workings of the wind bikes. They seemed invincible and effortless. The dark and puffy roof of the forest below them looked like a churning sea of storm clouds, making him feel higher in the sky than a few hundred feet. It was a little awkward holding on to Sato at first, but he enjoyed the rush of speed and the whipping wind. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be Superman. They travelled for half an hour before Mothball held up her hand to signal the others to slow down. The black purple of the sky had slowly brightened into a mixture of oranges and reds. Streaks of fiery clouds scratched across it. Tick could see the main forest ended a mile or so ahead and almost swallowed his tongue when he saw what towered above the land beyond. It was a massive fortress of stone and rock, still dark against the scant light of dawn. Dozens of towers and bridges dotted its skyline. It had to be the single largest structure Tick had ever seen, bigger by far than even the Seahawks American football stadium. It appeared that not only had Mistress Jane discovered a land full of something like magic, she'd set herself up in a castle fit for a king from a fantasy book in the library. Tick was in awe and had the sudden urge to explore the place. The three wind bikes hovered next to each other, everyone in stunned silence as they gawked at the castle of Mistress Jane. "Calls it the Lemon Fortress, she does," Mothball said. "Why, that woman loves the colour yellow so much, it's beyond me. Loony, she is." "Are you sure they can't see us?" Paul asked. "Not sure at all. Come on, down we go. Got to be about our business." She pushed on her handlebars and flew towards the edge of the forest, the other two wind bikes right behind her. They passed over the green cliff of the tightly packed trees and descended towards the ground, where a lush lawn of grass and wildflowers was sliced by the sinewy curve of a huge sparkling blue river that spilled out from underneath the castle before finally disappearing into the forest. Not a person was in sight, and in a matter of seconds the group had settled on the ground next to the deep, slowly moving waters, close enough to the trees to smell bark and pine. "Where is Annika?" Sophia asked, not bothering to hide the frustration in her voice. "Be along directly, she will," Mothball replied, but her face showed signs of worry as she stared at the Lemon Fortress with a creased brow. From where they waited, they could see a cobblestone path running along the river and up to a large double-doored entrance of the castle, just a few hundred feet away. Next to it, the river seemed to magically appear from nowhere, bubbling up from under the cold blocks of the castle's granite. At the moment, not a thing stirred anywhere except for the trickling river and the early rising birds of the forest. Tick was about to say something when Mothball shushed him, holding up a hand as she perked her ears, looking around for signs of mischief. At first, Tick couldn't hear anything, but then the faintest sounds of giggling and high-pitched chatter came from everywhere at once, bouncing along the lawn in front of them and from the trees behind them. "What is that?" Paul whispered. The creepy cacophony of hoots and howls and wicked laughter grew louder. "That can't be good," Sophia muttered, her eyes wide in her frightened face. "Mothball, what's going on?" "Methinks we've been found out, I do," she answered, standing to get a better look at the Lemon Fortress. "Sounds like the Fangin to me, and they be coming fast. We may have to fight a bit after all. Don't worry, the lugs are still blind and clumsy, so all you need to do is move a lot and shoot 'em with these little gems." She pulled out several dark green cylinders from a side pocket of her backpack and passed one to each of the kids. They were thin and several inches long, one end tapering to a point. Tick took his and examined the shiny surface, noticing a small button towards the thicker end. "What's this?" he asked. There's a sound slicer," Mothball answered. "Point the narrowed bit at the beasties when they get close and push the button. Keep 'em off you, Will." "What does it?" Sophia began. Before she could finish her question, the sound of wood scraping against stone echoed through the air. Everyone turned in unison to see the wide double doors of the castle opening outwards like the gaping jaws of a monster. The seam in the middle had barely grown a foot wide before a woman with long black hair shot out of it, dressed in a bright green dress, running with strained and frantic effort. In her right hand she held a long golden rod, the barrier wand. "It's Annika!" Mothball roared as she jumped back onto her wind bike. "Quick, fly to her, fly to her!" She shot into the air and down the path of the river, running towards the running woman, who kept looking behind her, terrified. She shouted something as she ran, but they were too far away to hear her. As Tick scrambled onto the wind bike behind Sato, he saw tall, gangly figures pouring through the castle doors, more and more as the exit opened wider. He couldn't tell what the creatures were, but they seemed wrong somehow. They were basically human in shape, but all comparisons ended there. Sato shot through the air and pulled up beside Mothball as they drew closer to Annika. "What are those things?" he yelled. The creature's skin was a putrid hue of yellow, like they'd been infected with some horrible disease. Clumpy patches of hair sprang from their bodies in random places, and they wore only scant, filthy clothing. That looked like tattered sheets that barely covered their thick torsos. Their eyes were mere slits, burning red pupils peeping out like a glimpse of hot lava, and their mouths, they were huge, full of pointy spikes of enormous teeth. "Them's the Fangin," Mothball shouted. "Nasty beasties they are, but we can fight 'em off with a bit of effort." Even as she spoke, the hackles and cries from the Fangin grew louder. Tick looked around in horror as he saw more of the sickly creatures appearing from everywhere, out of ditches, over the crest of the surrounding hills, out of the forest. They came from all directions, some bounding along on 4 of their skinny arms and legs, others running upright, still others had things sprouting off their backs, membranous extensions resembling dirty sails, tautly flapping in the wind. With horror, Tick realised they were wings. "By the way," Mothball yelled, readying herself to dive for Annika, "Fangin can fly." High above the grounds, safe in her room, Mistress Jane sat next to the open air of her window, listening with glee to the horrific sounds of her attacking army. Amazing what the power of this twisted and evil reality could create. This was her first practical use of the Fangin. How wonderful! But with so many against so few, it hardly seemed fair. She looked down in her lap, where she cradled the cicada drive like a newborn baby. Without it, the pathetic band of Realitants could never use her barrier wand to escape, and she had already received word that Master George's wand had been damaged beyond repair in the Battle of the Bermuda Triangle. Good news all around. She did feel a little saddened by Annika's betrayal. Jane had trusted her with so many trivial and demeaning duties. What a pity she'd have to be done away with. Mistress Jane screamed for something to eat. She had a show to enjoy before she sat down to strategize for her meeting with Reginald Chew in a few days. Her plan to make the universe a better place had officially begun. Sophia had fallen far behind the other 2 wind bikes, too shocked by the sight of the onrushing creatures to push ahead any faster. She spun in a slow circle as she took it all in. The Fangin were everywhere. The sight of the tall, awkward creatures with their bony arms and legs attached to a thick, solid torso, and their disgusting skin and patches of greasy hair made her sick. "Man, what are those things?" Paul shouted from behind her. "Your long-lost cousins," Sophia yelled back, knowing there couldn't possibly be a worse time to make a joke, but unable to stop herself. "Hilarious! Now hurry up and catch up with Mothball." Sophia was about to push forwards on the handlebars when something appeared right in front of them, shooting up from the ground. One of the creatures, its enormous mouth bearing fangs the size of small knives, hovered in mid-air, blocking their pathway. It looked hungry. Sophia saw the wings for the first time, furled out behind the Fangen like a horrific version of giant palm leaves. From behind her, Paul suddenly screamed. The Fangen moved twice as fast as Annika could run, and they were almost on top of her as Mothball dove towards the ground like a hawk on a field mouse. Her heart hurt at seeing the terror on her old friend's face as she ran, the fierceness in Annika's eyes enough to turn water to stone. Mothball leaned on the handlebars, willing the windbike to move faster. She wasn't close enough to use her sound slicer, and even if she were, she couldn't use it. The thing would turn Annika's brain to jelly. A Fangen jumped onto Annika's back, throwing her to the ground. Annika rolled, gripping the barrier wand with both hands and swinging wildly. She hit the creature in the face, a strange bark coming out of its mouth as it reared back in pain. Annika scrambled to her feet and kept running, the horde of Fangen right on her tail. The clumsy things constantly stumbled over each other, but never lost ground due to sheer numbers. Mothball was almost by Annika, screaming at her to keep running, though Mothball was bigger than the usual rider of a windbike, leaving no room for another passenger. She felt sure she could somehow lift Annika up and away from the monsters. Of course, the disgusting things could just leap into the air with their warped cicada melded wings, but she'd deal with one thing at a time. About 40 feet away, Mothball realised she was too late. Several Fangen had caught up with Annika, flanking her to make sure she couldn't fight her way out again. Her eyes met Mothball's, and they seemed so full of fear that Mothball worried Annika might drop dead of it. Determined to fight her way into the melee and save Annika and the wand or die trying, Mothball surged forwards. She was almost there when Annika threw the barrier wand into the air as hard as she could, the shiny rod glistening in the morning sun as it windmilled end over end towards Mothball. An instant later, Annika disappeared under a mass of writhing yellow skin and claws. Mothball reached out and caught the wand with her right hand, screaming with fury at the beasts below her, knowing it was too late to save her friend. Tick and Sato watched the entire ordeal play out from dozens of feet behind Mothball. Flying in to help, Tick didn't know if he should cheer or cry when their tall friend caught the barrier wand in her hand. He had time to do neither. A pack of 3 flying Fangen attacked their windbike in a swarm of sharp claws and spiky fangs and flapping wings. Paul screamed when the claws raked down his back, trying not to picture in his mind what it had done to his skin. On instinct, he gripped Sophia harder for support and kicked behind him with his right leg. He felt a solid thump as his foot connected, followed by a hair-raising shriek that faded as the creature fell to the ground. Sophia gunned the windbike forwards. It smashed into a flying Fangen and sent it reeling to the side, hissing in frustration. Paul felt himself slipping backwards and had to pull himself back onto the seat, all the while looking below them at the unbelievable sight. Everywhere he looked, more and more of the nightmarish creatures appeared, snapping at the air with their vicious fangs. "Use the thing Mothball gave us," Sophia yelled from up front, pulling it out of her pocket as she spoke. "Sound slicer," Paul whispered to himself as he grabbed his own. Together, they aimed the little cylinders at the nearest pack of Fangen and pushed the buttons. A low sound vibrated through the air, barely discernible but heavy, rattling Paul's bones as if he'd been standing next to a tolling cathedral bells. Below them, the Fangen suddenly plummeted towards the ground like they'd been hit with an invisible tidal wave. "War," Paul said. In tandem, he and Sophia swept the area below them, firing the sound slicer at anything in sight. Hordes of Fangen fell from the sky. "Find Mothball," Paul yelled in Sophia's ear. Tick had never really been in a fight in his entire life. He'd always walked away from them or taken a punishment or avoided them. But now he had no choice. With one hand clutching Sato's shirt, he punched and kicked with his other 3 limbs, thrashing wildly as he frantically tried to avoid the fangs and claws of the Fangen. Sato swerved back and forth with the windbike, alternately accelerating and slamming on the brakes, popping up and down, trying his best to get away from their attackers. But for every one that fell away, 2 more seemed to show up. Tick felt his elbow connect with something solid, heard an eerie yelp. His feet kicked away a fangon on each side of the bike at the same time. He punched another one square in the small slit of its eyes. More of the beasts swarmed in. Tick reached into his pocket and pulled out the cylinder he'd received from Mothball, only to have it knocked out of his hands, falling to the ground below. He felt something sharp on his shoulder blade, turning around to see that one of the fangon had grabbed his scarf, pulling itself closer with jaws wide open. Tick had to let go of Sato with his other hand as he swung his elbow up and around as hard as he could, slamming it into the beast's neck. It screamed and fell away. At that very moment, Tick's stomach shot up into his throat as the windbike suddenly plummeted towards the ground. He just barely grabbed the edges of the seat, turning towards the front of the bike. His heart skidded when he saw that Sato had disappeared. He looked up just in time to see two fangon flying away, Sato firmly in the grasp of their claws. Oh my God. Chapter 48, Double Doors. Fraser Gunn watched the action from his perch high atop the walls of the Lemon Fortress. Seeing the swarms of fangon descend on the few Realitants, especially the big one who'd kidnapped him in the Alaskan cemetery, gave him a grim sense of satisfaction. His place in Mistress Jane's hierarchy would surely skyrocket after this victory. He saw the tall woman, grasping the useless barrier wand, dodging and weaving through hundreds of fangon as she tried to escape. He worried slightly she might break it, even though it couldn't be used without Cicada drive. The shell itself was a complex instrument in its own right that would take months to replace, but the army of creatures had direct orders to retrieve it safe and sound. Everything would be fine. Surprised by a sudden yawn, Fraser decided he'd had enough. The fangon were already boring him. He turned around and went back into the castle proper, hoping Miss Jane might call on him for congratulations very soon. Tick knew Sato's fate was sealed if Tick couldn't gain control of the wind bike before it crashed into the ground below. The bike twisted and pitched back and forth as it fell, throwing his senses into complete chaos. He steeled himself, forcing his eyes and hands to focus on the leather seat, pulling himself forward towards the handlebars. Though he didn't dare look, he could feel the lawn and river rushing up to smash him to bits. He only had seconds to live unless with one last grunt, he yanked himself upright and squeezed his legs on both sides of the bike's body. He quickly grabbed the handlebars and bent them towards the sky. With a lurch that almost made his stomach implode, the windbike slowed to a halt, then shot straight back up into the air as dozens of fangon repositioned themselves to attack him again. Tick looked in the direction that Sato had been taken. He could just see his flailing body resisting the two creatures that whisked him away. They were on a direct course for the top of the castle. In the next instant, a million thoughts seemed to flow through Tick's mind, processing and reprocessing. A few months ago, he'd made a very difficult decision, even though his life had become frightening, just as Master George had promised it would, and even though he could have made it all go away with a simple toss of the first letter into the fire, he hadn't done it. Some courage he didn't know he had, some sense of duty and right he didn't know was so powerful, had swelled inside his heart and given him the conviction to make an extremely hard choice. He remembered thinking of his little sister Kayla and what he might do if her life were at stake. And now, truly for the first time in his existence, Tick had a chance to risk his own life to save another. The question posed by Master George so long ago popped back into his mind. Will you have the courage to choose the difficult path? Tick screamed Sato's name and slammed the handlebars up and forwards, bulleting the windbike in a straight path towards the fangon, towards Sato. Sophia continued to fly the windbike as crazily as she dared, swerving and diving and skyrocketing upwards in an attempt to evade the countless creatures coming after them. Her head hurt from the effort. Her stomach begged her to stop. Behind her, Paul continued to shoot as many fangon as he could with the sound slicer, defending her as she drove. He'd slipped and almost fallen several times, but she had no choice to keep flying forwards. She caught a glimpse of Tick streaking past her on his windbike, alone. Where was Before she could finish her thought, one of the flying creatures slammed into them from the side, driving its head into the engine of the bike. Sophia lurched, barely hanging on as the body of the beast flipped under them and fell to the ground. She felt Paul squirming behind her to right himself on the seat. "What was that thing doing?" he asked. Unfortunately, they got their answer a second later, with a loud splutter of electronic coughs, then a low whine that sounded like a baby elephant caught in a trap. The wind bike stopped working completely. This time, Sophia and Paul screamed in unison as they dropped towards the ground far below. Tick had halved the distance to Sato and his captors in a matter of seconds. Even though they could fly, the Fangen were no match for the wind bikes when it came to speed. Tick leaned forwards, keeping his eyes focused on his target. He tried not to think of what would happen if they suddenly decided to drop Sato. Mothball used the barrier wand like a staff, swinging it in wide arcs as she darted about on her wind bike, knocking the heads of the Fangen, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. She realised they'd been a whole heap of mess if she broke the ruddy wand, but Master George had always said things were sturdy enough to withstand most punishment. She'd just landed a particularly nice hit on a creature when she caught a flicker of dark movement to her right. She looked to see Paul and Sophia and their bike plummeting towards the ground. She zoomed in that direction without an instant's hesitation. Sophia's windbike sputtered sporadically, humming to life with a jolt for the briefest of moments before dying again. Paul hugged Sophia tightly from behind, probably hoping she'd never bring it up again should they somehow survive. But Sophia knew they'd be dead in seconds and wondered what life as a realitant might have been like. She thought she might have liked it. Mothball didn't have time to think or ponder several options. Only one made sense, and she went for it, quickly stuffing the barrier wand through a belt loop with one hand while she steered with the other. In a nosedive that made her eyes water, she rushed towards Sophia and Paul, who clung to their useless windbike as it plummeted in a downward spiral. Their present course would smash them against a group of boulders clustered close to the river. Mothball intended to change that course. At the last second before she caught up with the falling bike, Mothball swerved hard to the right, then arrowed back in straight at Sophia and Paul, keeping pace with their rate of descent, knowing she only had one shot. As soon as she made contact, Mothball gunned her own windbike, pushing the other one at an angle as it fell towards the river. What had been certain death was now a chance if the ruddy water was deep enough. Tick flew up and over the stone parapet, bordering the massive crown of the castle, then skimmed along the loose gravel covering the roof. The 2 Fangen had touched down, folding their wings behind them. Sato was clutched between them, his head hanging low. When they spotted Tick, the 2 Fangen howled out a piercing cry, seeming to dare Tick to attempt a rescue. From both sides of the castle walls, more of the creatures charged in, hungry to join the fight. Tick never slowed down. "Sato!" he screamed. "Duck!" The boy showed no signs he'd heard or even planned to do as he was told, but Tick knew he had no other choice. He leaned forwards, trying to envision in his mind what he was about to do. "Sato!" he screamed again, only 30 feet away. "Duck now!" To Tick's relief, Sato buckled his legs and fell towards the roof, catching his captors by surprise. Though they didn't let go, both Fangen looked down at Sato, their attention diverted for an instant, their heads high enough to serve as a perfect target. Tick yanked back and to the left on the handlebars, leaning hard to the left as the windbike spun, slowing as the back end swerved around and slammed into the upper bodies of the 2 Fangen. Tick felt a jolt of pain as one of the creatures bit at his right leg before it toppled over. Both of the horrible creatures let go of Sato, stunned by the sudden impact. Tick steadied the windbike and lowered it all the way to the loose rocks of the roof. "Get on!" he yelled. Dozens of Fangen were charging right for them. Sato was bruised and battered, his face still pale with the terror of being captured, but he crawled... But he crawled to the bike He crawled to the bike and pulled himself onto the seat, Tick helping him the last few inches. Out of the corners of his eyes, Tick saw a blur of yellowed skin and vicious claws. He felt an icy touch on his elbow. Before anything could take hold, Tick shot the windbike up and away from the sea of disgusting monsters. A storm of Fangen took flight in pursuit. Paul had absolutely no idea what happened. His mind had been fading, shutting down into a blissful state of unconsciousness, so he didn't have to feel the excruciating instant pain when his body smacked into the ground. But everything changed in a sudden rush of intense cold and wetness. Water engulfed him, filling his lungs as he instinctively sucked in air at the shock of the impact. As he felt his feet slam into the river bottom, hard enough to almost break his legs, he sputtered and coughed, his instincts trying to prevent him from taking another breath and killing himself. The next instant, he felt a massive arm grab him around the chest and pull him through the water. But not up, not towards air. The arm pulled him to the side, skimming his body along the sandy river bottom. Paul had one moment to wonder if he was dead before everything grew very dark. Tick shot into the open air away from the castle, his blood freezing at the sight of countless Fangen everywhere. The air was full of them, defying gravity as they flew with their pale, weak-looking wings. More crawled and ran across the grounds, an endless army of ants. Not knowing where to go or what to do, Tick frantically searched the sky and the ground for any glimpse of his friends. A flash of red far below caught his eye, one of the windbikes in the river, and no sign of anyone near it. His heart sinking faster than he could ever fly, Tick slammed on the handlebars and catapulted towards the ground. After swimming under a thick stone arch from which the slow-moving river exited the Lemon Fortress, Mothball kicked with all of her might towards the surface, dragging both Sophia and Paul in her arms. Desperate for air, she could only imagine how her two little friends were doing, if they still lived. Her head broke through the surface with a loud splash. She sucked in the most refreshing breath of her life. Even as she did so, she pulled up with her arms, bringing Paul and Sophia's faces above the waterline. Mothball's heart almost leaped out of her chest when both of the kids coughed and sputtered for air. With an inexplicable laugh, she dragged them to the side of the river, where she helped them climb out and onto a wide stone walkway. Paul fell over, spitting and sucking. Sophia seemed better, taking in slow, deep breaths as she looked around her, her eyes wide. They stood next to a river in a long, dark tunnel that delved in one direction for what seemed like an eternity, no end in sight. On the other side, the river disappeared under a thick stone wall flowing outside the castle. Next to that stood the huge wooden doors they'd seen from the outside. They were still halfway open and letting in enough light to prevent them from being in complete darkness. "This is where those creatures came from," Sophia whispered. "Best be glad they're not here now," Mothball muttered. She pulled the barrier wand out of the huge belt loop where she'd stuck it for safekeeping. Paul had recovered enough to stand up, his chest still heaving as he fought to catch his breath. What happened to Tick and Sato? As if in answer, they heard Tick shout from outside the doors, "Mothball!" His windbike had flown down from somewhere above. He hovered just outside, Sato on the back. "Wait a minute," Paul said. "I thought Sato was driving the bike." "Quick!" Mothball yelled, ignoring Paul. "Get in here!" She saw Tick obey immediately, shooting the windbike through the narrow space between the half-open doors. Even as he did, Mothball grabbed the long ropes hanging from inside the huge slabs of wood that served as handles to pull them close. "Help me!" she yelled. As the others moved to her side and pulled with her, Mothball looked outside. Just before the doors slammed shut with a loud boom, she saw the hideous sight of countless Fangen charging directly for them.